The mind map provides a categorized overview of the most useful Kubectl commands, grouped by their function in managing Kubernetes clusters. Here's an explanation of each section. 1. Cluster information. Kubectl cluster info displays basic information about the Kubernetes cluster, such as the master and DNS services. Kubectl get nodes lists all the nodes in the cluster, along with their status, roles, and other details. Kubectl get all shows all the resources, pods, services, deployments, etc. in the default namespace, giving a comprehensive view of what is running. Happer 2, pod management. Kubectl get pods lists all the pods in the current namespace, showing their status and other basic information. Kubectl describe pod provides detailed information about a specific pod, including events, resource usage, and configuration. Kubectl logs retrieves the logs for a specific pod. This is useful for debugging and monitoring. Kubectl exec allows you to run commands inside a running pod, such as opening a shell, bin bash for troubleshooting. 3. Deployment management. Kubectl get deployments lists all deployments in the current namespace, showing their status and the number of replicas. Kubectl scale deployment changes the number of replicas for a given deployment to handle scaling needs. Kubectl rollout status checks the status of a rollout to ensure that a deployment is proceeding as expected. Kubectl rollout undo reverts a deployment to a previous revision in case of a failed update or rollback requirement. 4. Service and networking. Kubectl get services lists all services showing their type, e.g. cluster IP, node port, and other details. Kubectl port forward allows local port forwarding to a pod, making it easier to test services running within the cluster. Kubectl expose creates a new service to expose a pod or deployment, enabling network access to the application. 5. Config and resource management. Kubectl apply applies a configuration file, YAML, or JSON to create or update a resource. Kubectl edit opens the configuration of a resource in a text editor for manual editing. Kubectl delete removes a specific resource, such as a pod, deployment, or service. Kubectl config current context displays the current context used for connecting to the Kubernetes cluster. Kubectl config use context switches to a different context for managing multiple clusters or environments. Namespace management. Kubectl get namespaces lists all namespaces in the cluster, which are used for resource organization and isolation. Kubectl config set context sets the default namespace for future Kubectl commands, reducing the need to specify it each time. This mind map provides a comprehensive guide to essential Kubectl commands for managing various aspects of a Kubernetes cluster, from basic cluster information and pod management to handling deployments, services, configurations, and namespaces. These commands help simplify Kubernetes administration and improve productivity for DevOps and Kubernetes users.